1942. A small farming village in the Gyeonggi province, Korea. The rice fields stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun, their golden stalks swaying like a quiet ocean. In the distance, mountains rose softly against the sky, their peaks fading into mist. This was a place where time moved slowly, where seasons dictated life, and where tomorrow was expected to look much like today. Yuki knelt beside the irrigation channel, her hands submerged in cold water as she washed radishes for the evening meal. She was 17. Her hair was tied back with a simple cloth, her dress worn but clean. Her face carried no exceptional beauty, no remarkable feature. Just the plain, honest look of a girl who had never been given reason to think of herself as anything other than ordinary. She lived with her grandmother in a modest house at the edge of the village. Her parents had died years ago, her father from illness, her mother not long after. The grief had settled into routine. Yuki had learned to cook, to mend clothes, to tend the small vegetable garden behind the house. She did not dream of grand things. She hoped one day to marry a kind man, perhaps have children, perhaps remain in this village, where she knew every face and every road. The war felt distant. She had heard about it, of course. The adults spoke in hushed tones about soldiers, about the Japanese Empire, about places she could not imagine. But the war did not touch her fields. It did not interrupt her chores. It existed somewhere else, in newspapers she could not read, in cities she had never seen. Her grandmother called from the doorway, "Yuki-ya, the water's ready." Yuki gathered the radishes into a basket and stood, brushing dirt from her knees. She walked back toward the house, passing the small shrine her grandmother kept near the entrance. A bowl of rice, a stick of incense, an offering to ancestors she barely remembered. Inside, the house smelled of miso and pickled vegetables. Her grandmother was stirring a pot over the fire, her back bent with age, her movements practiced and steady. They ate together in silence most nights. There was little to say. The days repeated themselves in comforting predictability. After dinner, Yuki sat outside on the wooden step, watching the sky turn violet. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Somewhere down the road, a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent. She thought about the boy from the next village, the one who had smiled at her during the harvest festival. He had kind eyes. Maybe, she thought, he would visit again. Maybe something would come of it. Maybe her life would unfold exactly as it was supposed to. The night was calm. The stars appeared one by one, cold and distant, indifferent to the earth below. Yuki did not know that in 3 days, men in uniforms would arrive at her door. She did not know that her name would be written on a list. She did not know that the life she imagined, the small, safe, ordinary life, was already gone. She sat on the step, breathing in the cool night air, and felt nothing but peace, the last peace she would know for a very long time. 3 days later, the truck arrived just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the fields and most of the village was barely awake. Yuki heard it before she saw it, an unfamiliar mechanical growl that didn't belong to the rhythm of the countryside. She was sweeping the front step when 2 men in dark uniforms stepped down from the vehicle. They weren't soldiers exactly, but they carried themselves with military certainty. One held a clipboard. The other scanned the houses with cold efficiency. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you?" The man with the clipboard didn't look up. "We're here for the girl, Tanaka Yuki." The sound of her own name, formal, official, made her stomach tighten. She had never been registered for anything, never been called by anyone outside the village. "What for?" her grandmother asked, her voice suddenly smaller. "Factory work. The Empire needs workers for the war effort. Good wages, safe conditions. She'll be able to send money home." The words came out practiced, rehearsed. The man finally looked at Yuki, his eyes moving over her with the detachment of someone evaluating livestock. 18 and unmarried, correct? 17, Yuki said quietly. "Close enough." Her grandmother stepped forward. "She's needed here. I'm old." "She takes care of—" "Many girls are going," the second man interrupted. "It's an honor to serve. The factory needs seamstresses. Clean work. She'll return when her service is complete." Yuki looked at the truck. Through the canvas covering the back, she could see shadows. Other girls, silent and still. 6, maybe 7 of them. She recognized one from a neighboring village, a girl named Hana who used to sell eggs at the market. "I don't want to go," Yuki said. The man with the clipboard finally showed emotion, a thin, patient smile that never reached his eyes. "This isn't optional. Your name is on the list. If you refuse, your family will be noted as uncooperative with the imperial effort." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. In occupied Korea, being noted meant visits in the night, disappeared neighbors, burned fields. Her grandmother's hand found Yuki's shoulder, gripping hard. "Ah, how long?" the old woman asked. 6 months, perhaps a year. Depends on the need. It was a lie. Yuki felt it in her bones, in the way the men wouldn't meet her grandmother's eyes, in the way they positioned themselves between her and the door. "Get your things," the first man said. "We leave in 5 minutes." Yuki moved as if in a dream. She packed a small bag, a change of clothes, the comb her mother had left her, a rice ball her grandmother pressed into her hands. The old woman was crying silently, tears running down the deep creases of her face. "Come back," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come back." Yuki wanted to promise. She wanted to believe she could. But as the men led her to the truck, as she climbed up beside the other silent girls, as the engine roared to life and the village began to shrink behind them, she understood with terrible clarity that promises meant nothing anymore. The truck turned onto the main road. Yuki watched through the gap in the canvas as her grandmother became a small figure, then a dot, then nothing. She never saw her again. The journey lasted 3 days. They traveled in darkness mostly, stopping only when the drivers needed rest. The girls were given rice balls and water twice a day, handed through the canvas without explanation. No one told them where they were going. No one answered their questions. Inside the truck, the silence was suffocating. Some girls cried quietly. Others stared at nothing, their faces blank with shock. Hana, the girl from the neighboring village, sat pressed against Yuki's side, trembling despite the heat. "They said factory work," Hana whispered on the second night. "That's what they told my father." Yuki said nothing. She had stopped believing the lie before the truck even left her village. On the 4th morning they arrived. The building stood alone in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. It was wooden, low, divided into sections like barracks. Barbed wire fenced the perimeter. Armed guards stood at intervals, their faces expressionless beneath their caps. This was no factory. The girls were ordered out. They stood in a line, blinking in the harsh sunlight, while a woman in a severe grey dress walked slowly in front of them. She was Japanese, middle-aged, with hard eyes that assessed each girl with clinical detachment. "You are here to serve the Imperial Army," she announced. "You will be given new names, new clothes, new duties. You will obey all orders without question. Disobedience will be punished severely." Yuki's throat went dry. "What kind of service?" one girl asked, her voice breaking. The woman smiled, a terrible, knowing smile. "Comfort." The word meant nothing and everything. It settled over them like ash. They were taken inside, stripped of their clothes, their belongings confiscated. Yuki watched as a guard took her mother's comb and threw it into a crate with dozens of other small treasures. Photographs, letters, prayer beads, everything that connected them to who they had been. They were given thin cotton kimonos and wooden sandals. Their hair was inspected for lice, their bodies examined by a military doctor who touched them with gloved hands and recorded notes on a clipboard. Yuki was assigned a number, 26. She was shown to a small room barely larger than a closet, a thin mattress on the floor, a wooden bucket in the corner, a single window covered with bars. "Soldiers will come," the woman in grey told her. "You will not refuse them. You will not cry. You will not make them uncomfortable. Do you understand?" Yuki stared at her, unable to speak, unable to process the meaning of the words. The woman leaned closer, her breath sour. "If you cause trouble, you will be made an example. We have many girls. You are replaceable." That night, Yuki lay on the mattress and listened to sounds she would never forget. Doors opening and closing, heavy footsteps, muffled crying from the other rooms. men's laughter cutting through the darkness. She pressed her hands over her ears and tried to remember her grandmother's face, the smell of miso soup, the feeling of cold water on her hands as she washed radishes in the field. But the memories were already fading, slipping away like smoke. She was no longer Yuki. She was 26, and the war had finally reached her. 2 years passed. Time stopped meaning anything. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. The seasons changed outside the barred window. Leaves turned gold. Snow fell, flowers bloomed. But inside, everything remained the same rooms, the same doors opening, the same mechanical routine that drained the soul more completely than any violence could. Yuki learned to disappear inside herself. When the soldiers came, she went somewhere else in her mind, back to the rice fields, back to her grandmother's kitchen, back to a version of herself that still existed somewhere beyond the walls. It was the only way to survive. Some girls didn't learn this trick. They broke quickly, crying during the examinations, refusing to eat, speaking to ghosts that only they could see. Those girls vanished. No one asked where they went. Everyone knew better than to ask questions. By 1945, something had shifted. The soldiers who came were different now, younger, more nervous, carrying a desperation that hadn't been there before. They spoke less. They left faster. Some looked afraid. The guards, too, had changed. They snapped at small infractions. They watched the road constantly. Supplies arrived less frequently. The rice rations grew smaller. Whispers spread among the girls during the brief moments they were allowed to wash or use the latrine together. The war is going badly. The Americans are coming. We're losing. Yuki didn't know what to feel. Hope seemed dangerous. Hope could break you worse than despair. Then came the day when everything became clear. The commandant, a severe man who rarely appeared, gathered all the girls in the courtyard. 43 of them now. Some could barely stand. Many were sick. All were hollow-eyed and silent. He stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. "The Empire is making strategic adjustments," he said. "This facility will be closed within the week." A tremor ran through the group. Closed. The word should have brought relief. It brought terror instead. One of the older girls, a woman named Sachiko, who had been there since the beginning, whispered what everyone was thinking. "They won't let us leave. We've seen too much. We know too much." The guards began disappearing files, burning documents in barrels outside. Trucks arrived and removed equipment, desks, medical supplies, records. Everything that proved what had happened here was being erased. At night, the girls huddled together, speaking in voices barely above breath. "They'll kill us before the Americans arrive. We're evidence. They can't let us talk." Yuki lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Hana crying softly in the next room. Hana, who had somehow survived alongside her, who had become like a sister in this nightmare. The cruelest part wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of dying nameless, of being buried in an unmarked grave in the forest, of her grandmother never knowing what happened, of the world moving on as if she had never existed. She thought about the number 26 painted on her door. She tried to remember her real name, and for a terrible moment it wouldn't come. Then it did. Yuki. She repeated it silently, over and over, like a prayer. Yuki, Yuki, Yuki. If she was going to die, she would die as herself, not as a number. August 15th, 1945. The morning arrived with an unfamiliar silence. Yuki woke to it, the absence of sound where sound should have been. No boots marching in the corridor, no barked orders, no metal doors clanging open and shut with mechanical regularity. Just silence. She sat up slowly on her mattress, her body stiff and aching as always. Through the barred window, dawn light filtered weakly into the room. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. She waited for the usual morning inspection. It didn't come. An hour passed, then another. Slowly, cautiously, doors began to open. Girls emerged into the hallway, looking at each other with confusion and fear. No one had given permission. No one had been summoned. But no one stopped them either. "Where are the guards?" someone whispered. Yuki walked to the end of the corridor and peered outside. The courtyard was empty, the guard post abandoned. The gate, always locked, always watched, stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. The girls gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, afraid to move too far, afraid to hope. "Maybe it's a test," Hana said, gripping Yuki's arm. "Maybe they're watching to see who tries to escape." It made sense. Everything here had been a trap, a punishment, a lesson in powerlessness. Why would this be different? They waited. Noon came. Still no guards. Still no orders. Then, in the early afternoon, they heard it. Vehicles, multiple vehicles. Heavy engines grinding up the dirt road that led to the facility. The girls scattered immediately, running back to their rooms, pressing themselves against walls, preparing for whatever came next. Yuki's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The execution they had been waiting for. But the engines didn't sound like the Japanese military trucks. The pitch was different. The rhythm unfamiliar. Through her window, Yuki watched as 3 large vehicles rolled into the compound. The soldiers who emerged wore uniforms she had never seen before, olive green, different helmets, different weapons. They moved with caution, rifles raised, scanning the buildings with tactical precision. Americans. The word rippled through the facility like electricity, but fear didn't disappear. It transformed. These were still men, still soldiers, still armed. The girls had learned that men with power did what they wanted, that uniforms didn't determine cruelty, that liberation could be another word for ownership. One of the American soldiers called out something in English. His voice was loud, but not harsh. He repeated it several times, then tried broken Japanese. "Safe now. War over. You safe?" No one moved. The soldiers didn't enter the building immediately. They stood in the courtyard, talking among themselves, looking at the barbed wire, the guard posts, the crude structures with growing comprehension on their faces. One soldier, younger than the others, with red hair and freckles, removed his helmet and ran a hand through his hair. He looked disturbed, almost sick. "Jesus Christ," Yuki heard him say, even though she didn't understand the words. Another soldier with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, spoke into a radio. More vehicles were coming, and he seemed to be saying, "Medical support, supplies." But still, none of them entered. They waited outside, as if understanding that their presence, male, armed, uniformed, was itself a threat. Yuki pressed her forehead against the bars of her window, watching these strange men in strange uniforms, trying to understand what was happening. The war was over. The guards were gone, but she didn't feel free. She felt suspended between one nightmare and an uncertain future, unable to trust either. Hours passed before anyone dared to step outside. The American soldiers remained in the courtyard, keeping their distance from the building. They had set up a small tent, laid out supplies, positioned themselves with careful deliberation, visible but not threatening, present but not imposing. It was Sachiko, the oldest among them, who finally emerged first. She walked slowly, her back rigid with defiance or fear. It was impossible to tell which. The soldiers watched her approach, but didn't move toward her. One of them, the sergeant, raised his hand in a stopping gesture, then pointed to a crate near the tent. Sachiko stopped 10 feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. The sergeant opened the crate and pulled out a canteen of water and what looked like wrapped food. He placed them on the ground, stepped back several paces, and gestured for her to take them. She stared at the items for a long moment, then at him. Slowly she approached, picked them up, retreated. He didn't follow, didn't speak, didn't demand anything. One by one, other girls began to emerge. Yuki waited until Hana took her hand and pulled her gently toward the door. Together they walked into the courtyard, blinking in the afternoon sunlight, their legs weak from confinement and malnutrition. The young red-haired soldier approached them but stopped several feet away. He was holding something, a blanket, thick and clean. He held it out, his movements slow and deliberate, the way you might approach a frightened animal. "For you," he said in broken Japanese. "Cold at night." Yuki and Hana didn't move. He set the blanket on the ground between them and stepped back, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. This was the moment that broke something inside Yuki, not the blanket itself, not the food or water, but the distance he maintained, the gentleness in his movements, the fact that he waited for permission that he didn't need to wait for. He had the power to take. Instead, he offered. He had the power to command. Instead, he waited. Another soldier appeared carrying a medical bag. He knelt near the tent and began setting out supplies. Bandages, medicine, clean cloth. He looked up at the girls and spoke softly to the sergeant, who nodded. "Doctor," the sergeant said, pointing to the man. "Help. Understand, help sick." Several girls were sick. Everyone knew it. Fevers, infections, illnesses that had gone untreated for months. But the doctor didn't approach. He simply sat there, making himself available, waiting for them to choose. The afternoon stretched into evening. The soldiers cooked food over a small fire, rice, vegetables, meat. The smell made Yuki's stomach clench with hunger. They filled bowls and left them on tables they had set up, then retreated to the far side of the courtyard. No demands, no conditions, no expectations of gratitude or submission. Just food, offered freely. Hana began to cry, not from fear but from something else, something that had been locked away for so long that its release felt almost painful. "They're not taking anything," she whispered. "They're just giving." Yuki picked up the blanket the soldier had left. It was heavy, warm, clean, cleaner than anything she had touched in 2 years. She looked across the courtyard at the young soldier. He was sitting on a crate, his rifle set aside, his hands empty. When he noticed her looking, he didn't smile or gesture. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement of her existence, her humanity. It was such a simple thing, but it shattered the wall she had built around herself to survive. For the first time in 2 years, Yuki allowed herself to believe that not all men were the same, that perhaps, impossibly, this might actually be over. The evacuation took 3 days. Medical personnel arrived, nurses, doctors, translators. They moved through the facility documenting everything, their faces growing harder with each room they entered, each story they heard. Photographers came too, their cameras clicking softly, preserving evidence of what the Japanese Imperial Army had done. Yuki was examined by a female nurse who spoke gentle Japanese and didn't ask questions that required answers. She was given clean clothes, a simple dress, underwear that fit, shoes that didn't fall apart. She was fed 3 meals a day. She was told she could go home. Home. The word felt foreign in her mouth. On the 4th day, the girls were loaded onto trucks, American trucks this time, with open backs and canvas covers, heading toward a refugee processing center in Seoul. Yuki sat between Hana and Sachiko, the blanket the soldier had given her wrapped around her shoulders. The red-haired soldier, she had learned his name was Jack, though she couldn't pronounce it properly, helped them into the vehicle. His hand was offered for support, nothing more. When Yuki took it, his grip was firm but brief. He let go the moment her feet were steady. "Safe now," he said again, the same broken Japanese he had repeated like a promise. "Go home. Be safe." She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him that his simple act of waiting, of not taking, of treating her like a person, had returned something to her that she thought was lost forever. But the words wouldn't come. Her voice had been taken from her months ago, and she didn't know how to reclaim it yet. So she just nodded, and he seemed to understand. The truck rumbled to life. As they pulled away from the facility, Yuki looked back one last time at the building that had erased her for 2 years. Smoke was rising from behind it. The Americans were burning it down, destroying the evidence of its existence. Good, she thought. Let it disappear. At the processing center, they were given papers, ration cards, train tickets. Officials asked questions. Name, age, home village, family? Yuki answered mechanically. Yes, she had a grandmother. Yes, she wanted to return to Gyeonggi province. Yes, she understood the journey would take several days. What they didn't ask, what no one asked, was whether she could ever truly return. The train south was crowded with refugees, soldiers, displaced families. Yuki sat by the window, watching Korea pass by, changed and unchanged. Fields still grew, mountains still rose, villages still stood. But she was not the girl who had left. That girl had died in a small room marked 26, and what remained was something else. A survivor, yes, but one carrying weight that would never fully lift. Hana sat beside her, holding her hand in silence. They didn't speak about what happened. There were no words adequate for it. When the train finally reached her village, Yuki stood on the platform with her small bag and her American blanket and tried to remember how to walk these familiar roads. Her grandmother's house appeared in the distance, smaller than she remembered, older. The door opened. Her grandmother stood there, aged beyond recognition, her face collapsing with impossible relief. Yuki. Her name. Her real name. Yuki walked forward, stepped into her grandmother's arms, and finally allowed herself to cry, not from joy, not from relief, but from the terrible understanding that she had survived something that would define every day that followed. The war was over, but the battle to live with what she had endured had only just begun.